Hi Hill City, I'm Sarah and I'm a part of the team here. If this is your first time watching with us this morning, we're really happy you chose to spend part of your weekend with us. We want you to know that Hill City is a safe place for you to explore your faith. And wherever you're coming from, we want to walk with you through any doubts, fears, or questions you have about Jesus and about faith. We'd also love to get connected with you so we can know who we're talking to every week. Head on over to this link to fill out a connection card so we can send you some fun mail. Don't forget, tonight is our first parking lot worship night, and it's our 6th birthday. It starts at 6:30, and you can park in the anthem lot across the street and walk on over. Also, outdoor community group signups are open. These awesome groups are a great way to meet people and get plugged into community here. They'll start the week of September 20th. Head on over to hillcityrva.com/community groups to sign up for one and start making some friends. Check-ins on Facebook this month go to support No Left Turns, an organization that helps those with court and justice involvement successfully thrive post-conviction. You can read more about them at noleftturns.org. All right, that's all for me. Next up, we've got some worship and then the first message in our Rerouting series. Thanks for being here.
Come on. Woo! I saw Satan fall like lightning. I saw darkness run for cover, but the miracle that I just can't get over, my name is registered in heaven. I believe in signs and wonders. I have resurrection power, yes I do, but the miracle that I just can't get over, my name is registered in heaven. Yeah, my praise belongs to you forever. This is my testimony from death to life, 'cause grace rewrote my story. I'll testify, by Jesus Christ I'm righteous, I'm justified. This is my testimony, this is my testimony. Together, sons and daughters, fought with blood and washed in water. Sing the praises of the Spirit, Son and Father. Our God will finish what He started. Yes, our God will finish what He started. Oh, this is my testimony from death to life, 'cause grace rewrote my story. I'll testify, by Jesus Christ I'm righteous, I'm justified. This is my testimony, this is my testimony. Whoa. Listen, if I'm not dead, then you're not done. Greater things still to come. Oh, I believe I'm not dead, you're not done. Greater things are still to come. Oh, I believe tearfall. You collect them all, and you don't waste our suffering. You're with us in the rain. This aching heart won't last forever. I know that all things work together, as if your love wasn't enough. You promised us all of heaven's secrets. I know that we will see it. There's nothing you keep from us. All I have to do is trust. You sing to all my sorrow and turn it into joy. The wind carries your whisper, and I can hear your still small voice. This aching heart won't last forever. I know that all things work together, as if your love wasn't enough. You promised us all of heaven's secrets. I know that we will see it, as if your love wasn't enough. You promised us all of heaven's secrets. I know that we will see it. There's nothing you keep from us. All I have to do is trust. And I can feel peace coming. I can see fear running. Your love, it just does something, sets my feet to dancing. And I can feel peace coming, and I can see fear running. Your love, it just does something, sets my feet to dancing. And I can feel peace coming, I can see fear running. Your love, it just does something, sets my feet to dancing. I can feel peace coming, and I can see fear running. Your love, it just does something, sets my feet to dancing, sets my feet to dancing, sets my feet to dancing, sets my feet to dancing. As if your love wasn't enough, you promised us all of heaven's secrets. I know that we will see it. As if your love wasn't enough, you promised us all of heaven's secrets. I know that we will see it. There's nothing you keep from us. All I have to do is trust you. There's an old hymn that says, Jesus, Jesus, how I trust you, how I prove you more and more. Jesus, Jesus, precious Jesus, oh, for grace to trust you more.
Well, hey, good morning, everybody. Hope you guys had an awesome week. And if you're new here, my name is John Wagler. I'm part of this Hill City team and so grateful that you are here. And today we actually celebrate our 6th birthday, which is so amazing. It's been 6 incredible years of God just showing up, doing amazing things, and just seeing so many lives change. Like, we've heard hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of stories over these 6 years of God just doing miraculous work in people's hearts. And you've been a part of a lot of change in this city and having a lot of influence in this city. And so thank you so much for being a part of this, whether you've been here from the beginning or just hopping in now. It's been really cool to be part of God's story here in Richmond. And we believe that even more and better things even are going to be coming here in the next 6 years, and then the 6 years after that, or however many we have here, and if the world doesn't end in November. But we're really excited about celebrating today because we're celebrating who God is. We're celebrating and what God has done. This is not about us. This is not about our leadership. This is not about any individual or any grouping of people, but it really is about what God has done. And so we really look forward to tonight, our worship night as well, for you guys to come out and sing with us and just celebrate and eat Pearl's cupcakes, which is our tradition here. So again, thank you so much for being a part of that. We really hope that Hill City, if you don't have a home church, that Hill City becomes a place that you can call home. And if you are just part of our Hill City family, just thank you and love you guys so much for making this community so great. We're kicking off a new series here this morning that I'm excited about, called Rerouting. And the whole premise of this is, this idea of being lost. And sometimes we get lost. I don't know if you're like me, but whenever I Google Map something and I'm on a trip, and if I veer off, or in particular here in Richmond, if I'm trying to find something and Google Maps gives me a direction and I go another route, it'll try and reroute me right back to where it wants me to go. However, a lot of times, just out of pure competitiveness, I like to think I know a better way, and I like to try. And how it gives you that time at the bottom, like, you'll arrive at this time. I'm like, I can beat that time, right? Like, they do that on every trip. We just went to Topsail last week, and we left there, and Google puts you'll arrive at 1:17, and I'm like, oh, I'll arrive before 1, thank you. And so anyway, that's just how I am with Google Maps. But there's this idea of being lost, and maybe you're kind of similar to me. But when we look around right now, there is that feeling, right? And I would say this, that there's also a difference between being lost emotionally, spiritually, relationally, and physically than just obviously what I'm talking about with directions. But 2020 has been an interesting year for me personally, and Lacey personally, and our family. We've been married for 19 years, a little over 19 years, and I would honestly say this has probably been the roughest year for us personally. And the pandemic This probably ranks like number 5 or 6 on our list, and I'll share some things around that at different points here in the future. But it's just been a hard year, and in a lot of different ways, and having to go through a bunch of different things. And so, but I would also say this: one, we've never wavered in our love of each other and the health of our marriage or anything. So that's been a beautiful thing. 2, in the midst of all of this, God's been so good. So honestly, I'm very thankful for what 2020 has been. I'm thankful to go through it and not trying to wish to go around it. I'm thankful for the lessons that I'm learning and having to go through, and what it's building in me, building in Lacey, building in our family, the resilience that's coming out of this as well. Because I believe that crisis can be a great teacher if we want it to be. And so even in this idea of rerouting and being being lost, I want us to like kind of press into this over the next few weeks here together as we look at some different components of where we might be lost a little bit. And I had this Dallas Willard quote that I just love. Lacey's reading a book called Renovation of the Heart, and she pointed this one out to me, and it says this. It says that the condition of lostness is not the same as the outcome to which it leads. We're not lost because we are going to wind up in the wrong place. We are going to wind up in the wrong place because we are lost. And I think that that is something that we've got to embrace, not just in these few weeks of talking about it together, but just in reality that, we are in a lost place, whether that's relationally, spiritually, emotionally, mentally, physically. We are in a lost place, not just because we're of this outcome. We were lost before it. And then we arrived at this place. And so our lostness, or what we feel when we recognize that we're lost, the reality is we needed a new route way before that. And so that there were things building it. And so over the next few weeks together, I want to just talk about a few things. And here's kind of the main idea that I wrote down for this series. And that's simply this, that God can give us a route, but we still have to choose to trust his direction. Let me say that again. God can give us a route, but we still have to choose to trust his direction. And so I think this year, honestly, has exposed a lot in us personally. It's exposed a lot in us communally. It's exposed a lot in us countrywide and even worldwide. And I think it's important to engage that because when we get lost, the route that we're on reveals that our end goal is not Jesus. You see, if the route that we're on, if the end goal is Jesus, then we're not going to get lost. Our life is not going to be in chaos. Even in the midst of crisis, there'll be some structure, some framework, some order. It will feel resilience coming out of it in those. Why? Because we are on a route to Jesus. We're on a route that gives us hope. We're on a route that gives us a different kind of future. We're on a route that allows us to give us strength and comfort in the midst of what can be incredibly difficult times that you might be going through as well. And so one of the things that I started thinking through with this series was like, what if we were just incredibly grateful for this year? Incredibly thankful. Like, what if in 2020, the idea was, thank God I'm alive in 2020. Thank God I got to experience this. Thank God I got to go through it, because guess what? Like, he can do so many good things through what we might feel like are hard things, or he can work so much in times of crisis and build things within us that we never would have experienced if we didn't go through it. And so that's what I really want to push us in through the next few weeks here together. And I want to start off by talking about that's something incredibly important to me. And for Lacey and I, as we co-lead this church and the rest of our staff, and I want to talk about the big church. So there, a lot of times you hear someone say something like this: there's big C church, meaning all the church together, like one big kind of anyone who calls themselves a Christian, all the denominations, all the versions of it. Then you got little C church, which would be like Hill City. Okay, so but I want to talk about like church in general. Also talk about us as a community as well. But what I think when you take a step back and you can see, honestly, big church, big C church is lost. Not everybody, but you see some lostness that's happening there. Some idolatry that's being exposed, some lack of commitment that's being exposed, some realities of you see it, well, you might say, well, how do you see it? Well, I think you can see it in frequency of like attendance towards things and connection towards things, not getting involved. You see lack of generosity going down, or you see generosity going down. You see people talking about each other, the divisive talk, the negative speech, the criticism, the pessimism. You see the way that we treat one another. It's gotten worse and worse and worse. You see people dividing over political opinions that have nothing to do with Jesus. You see people making judgments on people's hearts just because by the way they vote, which is like ridiculous, right? Like you just see all of this stuff happening in the Christian community. You get anonymous letters sometimes from people complaining. You don't get, I get that. So, but those are things that happen, right? And but why does that happen? It's because like there's some lostness that's there, and some things that need to be revealed and exposed and allow God to speak into. And I want to say this for our community. Some of the things I just described, and I joked about the letter, it's whatever, but some of the things I just described, I want to encourage you guys for our community, because in this season in 2020, our giving actually went up. And that says a lot about you guys as a community. It says a lot about us as our generosity and our hearts and our value of what we want to do. It has been a tense time when you look throughout, whether it's talking about race or whether it's talking about politics or in that, right? And I'll say this, you guys have been incredible for the most part in terms of how we engage it and in some of those tough conversations. And it might be certain things that are, whether I say it or someone else says it, or you might be having it in a watch party. It's been difficult and hard, but you're not running from it. We're embracing it and engaging it. And that's a beautiful, beautiful thing to do together. The involvement piece with discipleship, again, another couple hundred people choosing to be a part of the discipleship, a 6-month commitment, again, phenomenal. And the stories coming out of there, incredible. And so there's a lot of good and a lot of encouragement for our community, and it's awesome, okay? And we celebrate that. But I will say this, we also have to grow. We also have to take further steps. We also have to mature more. And we have to set an incredible example for those around us as well. And so I want to dig into this a little bit further and challenge us here today. I want to encourage us, but also challenge us and hopefully be fruitful for you. So I want to go to Matthew chapter 16 first, because sometimes I hear people say things like, well, I like Jesus, but I don't like his church and all that stuff, which I'll get to later on, how that's not even possible. But in Matthew chapter 16, Peter says, Jesus is talking with Peter, and he says this. He says, Simon Peter, let me stop. He had just got done talking to the disciples, and he gets to this point, and he's talking to them, wondering, who do you say that I am? Okay, and so Peter then responds. He says, you are the Messiah. And I'm going to highlight that because that's so important. The Son of the living God. Okay, so if you've got your Bibles, highlight that, however you take notes, whatever. And then Jesus replies, blessed are you, Simon of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by the Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, right? You see this name change happen there. And on this rock, I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And so whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. And so there's a lot here in this passage, and I want to hone in on this church part because of how critical this is in terms of how we think about church and why church is actually important and what it's supposed to show to people. And we first see Jesus talking to his disciples, and he's talking to them in Caesarea Philippi, which we were able to actually visit this exact spot when we went to Israel. So we actually did a devotional reading this passage in the exact spot Jesus would have been teaching this and everything. It was pretty cool. But there's this little... I don't want to say little, it's like a big kind of entryway into what looks like a cave, and then there's this pond of water down below. And Caesarea Philippi was actually an unbelievable pagan, secular area where they would do child sacrificing. There would a lot of witchcraft, a lot of kind of terrible things. And they believed in this hole of the cave, and because of what had dumped out into the water, and it put blood in the water. It was terrible, y'all. But they believed, they called it the gate of Hades, the gate of hell, because they believed that through there is where you got to it. And then through there is where a lot of evil and immorality and injustice was released. And so they kind of labeled it this way. So Jesus is actually talking about this literal place. I know a lot of times people say, is he talking about hell? But no, he's talking about this literal place in Caesarea Philippi and what was going on there. So he's speaking into this, and he says, listen, I'm going to build my church, but here's what he says that I think is interesting. If you look in the beginning, what is the church built on? Well, Jesus says that upon the confession of Peter. Well, what did Peter confess? He confessed that Jesus is Lord. He confessed that when he said that you're the Messiah. That's the idea. Jesus, you are the Christ. You are the Son of the living God. You are Lord of all things. All right? So that the church and people in the church will confess that. That's the church, okay? The people of God who confess that Jesus is Lord of all. So to say Jesus is Lord means that no one else or nothing else or no place else is, okay? So Jesus is Lord of all. And to confess that is what means that you're part of the church. Now, what does it mean to confess it? You see, for Peter and for everyone else in the New Testament, when we begin to see it, that it wasn't just a confession of words, it was then made out in actions of life. And so if there's no change in your life, if there's no kind of new creation, as Paul would say, if there's no, sometimes it's super dramatic, but for others, it's kind of a slower process, which is okay. But if there's no change, if there's no movement, if there's no difference in your heart, if there's no difference in the way you live, then the reality is, and the probability is that confession was just words. It was actually not from your heart. But what we're seeing here with Peter is that, there was something deep within his heart. That's why Jesus says, that was not revealed to you by man. That was revealed to you by my Father in heaven, by the work of the Spirit in you, that there's something different. So this is not coerced. This is not manipulated. This is not an emotional moment. It is something in the depth of Peter's soul that says, I'm going to confess that you are Lord, and my life is going to change because of it. That is the church. The people. So when someone says, I raised my hand, or I said yes to Jesus, but there was no life change, there was nothing there, and there's nothing that like remotely changed even internally, then it was just words. It wasn't real. That when to actually confess that Jesus is Lord also comes out in how you live and how you think. And yes, you can be in process. I'm not talking about being perfect or super mature in the beginning, but yes, you can be in process, but there is something different in the inside of us. And so if you don't feel that, then I would say, man, you've got some soul searching to do. Or maybe your heart has become really hard. Like even in this season, it's like, man, if you haven't seen God cultivating something new in you, if you're not seeing this transformational thing during this crisis, if you're not feeling it and sensing it and being a part of this, then I would say either it's not real in you or your heart has become hardened to the things of God. If you're walking away from 2020 and you've had no movement, and you've been more concerned about fighting people about politics, or more concerned about fighting people about racial stuff, or more concerned about your opinions, or more concerned about being divisive, or more whatever the other things are. I don't even know. I mean, money or whatever. If you've not seen any movement inside of you, then either that confession that you said you did wasn't actually real, or maybe it was real, but your heart has become incredibly hardened. What's interesting here too is Jesus says this, I will build my church. He doesn't say Hill City will build his church. He doesn't say some other church will build his church. He doesn't say this individual. He says, I will build my church. And the gates of hell will not overcome this. Well, what's the gates of hell or gates of Hades? It means evil, immorality, injustice will not overcome my church. Why? Because I build my church. Jesus builds the church, okay? So it does not matter what is happening in a country. It does not. Listen, I was just reading about Ethiopia. We talk about having persecution here. It's laughable compared to what actually goes on in the rest of the world. But in Ethiopia right now, they are going door to door and murdering Christians. I read the other day, 500 recently have been murdered by knocking on the door, and they go right in the house and murder anyone who's a Christian. Okay, and so, but what's happening in Ethiopia? The church is growing. The church is not dying. Why? Because Jesus builds his church. Now, I'm not saying I want that or anything like that. And so, but Jesus builds his church. So we don't need anyone else to build his church. Jesus builds his church. He needs people, though, to confess that he is Lord and to actually seek him out in that way. And when we do that, and here's kind of the first point here, you might be thinking, oh, dear Lord, did we just get the first point? The rest will be quicker. Here's the first point. The church matters, okay? The church matters because it is supposed to show, number one, a picture of the kingdom of heaven. Jesus says that when we confess that he is Lord, Jesus says that when he's building his church and when his people are humbly and committed to following him and are pushing away pride and greed and all those things and engaging him like they should, and the Spirit of God is working within them, that when that happens, we get the keys to the kingdom of heaven. So that when people see the church, they should say, oh, You guys are showing what the kingdom of heaven is going to be like. You guys are showing what heaven will be like on this earth now. You're giving us a glimpse of a future hope. That's what the church is supposed to show. If it doesn't show that, we are trying to build his church and not Jesus. If it doesn't show that, the confession might not actually be real. If it doesn't show that, the confession might show actually we have really hardened hearts. If it doesn't show that, we are getting it wrong and we are lost and we need to be rerouted. It's important. It's pivotal. And let me ask you this. What do non-Christians say about the church right now? You see, I get it. No matter how good you do stuff, you'll be labeled certain things and people will say stuff about you. And no matter how good our church would be, of course, people are going to disagree or might say, that's not real, that's not. And I get all of that stuff. But man, even in the midst of that, if you look back to early church, even when people theologically disagreed or said some pretty bizarre things about them, they couldn't get over the fact of how they loved the community around them. They couldn't get past the fact how unbelievably generous they were. They couldn't believe that people who disagreed about life and came from different backgrounds and men and women, young and old, Jew and Gentile, all this stuff, like they couldn't believe they all came together because they didn't see it anywhere else in the world. They didn't see it anywhere else in culture. So do people say that about the church now? If they don't, we've got some rerouting that needs to happen because we're lost. Here's the second thing, that the church should be the presence of God. Now I'm going to draw a little bit for you guys. And so if you're just joining in, I've been doing this a lot recently. I promise I'm not going to do this every week, but it seems to be going in this direction. But I want to say that the church becomes the presence of God. Now, how does it become the presence of God? Well, we're going to read a passage out of 1 Corinthians 3 here in just a second, but I'm going to take you back to the beginning again. I did this all last series, and it's interesting. Even when Jesus does the same thing, Paul does this a lot in his writings. Whenever there's a debate about something, they always go back to the creation. Whenever there's a debate about what's going on, what about marriage? What about this? What about sex? What about that? Whatever it is. What about the church? They go back to creation. So what's interesting here is when you look at the beginning of creation and what was transpiring, you had God as creator, and so He creates this big, it says from darkness to light, and so this big expanse begins to happen. And then within this, He creates this earth. And then within that, it says that there was this land, all right? So in this land was Eden, okay? And part of this land was Eden. This region was called Eden. But in there was the garden. So we'll just kind of put this as like a little bullseye there. In that was the Garden of Eden. And there's where the presence of God was available. And with humanity had this incredible relationship with God. And it was in its perfect union, its perfect state. And they were together. And there was this beauty at creation, this beauty of what should be, of what humanity should be with God. But sin comes in and breaks that. Well, if you fast forward about 400 years, and you hear a little bit about the story of Israel and everything and the tabernacle and this thing that was happening, but they then build something different called the temple. And the temple actually modeled the creation story. And so it did, because here's what the temple was like. The temple had outer courts, it had inner courts, and then it had this Holy of Holies. And then again, right here, in the Holy of Holies was what was considered the presence of God, okay? And in this presence, and in this temple, it became the hub of the community. It became a place where people gathered. The temple became where you would restore this broken relationship with God. The temple became this part where you experienced like something in the Holy of Holies that like only a few people would actually get to experience this, but the presence of God was there. And wherever the presence of God was with His people, people flourished. Wherever they were in the presence of this temple, they experienced something very different. It set new guidelines for how they were supposed to live. It allowed them to look to the future of what was supposed to be. It was placed in the middle of the community because not only was that where people would gather, but because it was in the middle, it had this incredible impact. The presence would have this incredible impact throughout this community. Well, then here's what then happens. Fast forward a little bit further. Jesus comes along. And then I'm just going to write this down. In Matthew 12, verse 6, Jesus actually says that something better than the temple is here. He's talking to some Pharisees, and he says, something better is here. And what was that something better than the temple? Him. So if you see this, the temple was supposed to emulate creation and house the presence of God. And then Jesus says, but I'm giving you something that's better than the temple. And that's me. So Jesus is the better temple. Okay, and so then what ends up happening is Jesus dies and he, rises again. And then this guy named Paul comes along as one of the early writers of the New Testament. And look what he says here in 1 Corinthians 3, verse 16 and 17. He says, don't you know that you yourselves are what? God's temple. And that God's Spirit, right, the presence of God, dwells in your midst. If anyone destroys God's temple, what's that? Immorality, injustice, sin, evil, all of these things, right? God will destroy that person. For God's temple is sacred, and you together are that temple. This is unreal that Paul is saying this. So we've moved from the creation story to the human-made temple and what that was supposed to be for the Israelites and the Jewish people to Jesus saying, hey, listen, I'm the temple and like everything, I'm the presence of God and all this stuff. And now guess what? You guys are the temple. You are supposed to be the presence of God because of the work of the Spirit inside of us. And so here's what this means. And this is fascinating to me. That when people encounter the church, they should say, this must be what God is like. Why? Because Jesus, okay, when we look at Jesus, we look at, when someone's like, what was God like? Or what is God like? We say, well, that's Jesus, and look what he taught. Well, then we're supposed to emulate what Jesus taught. So when people encounter the church, they should say, whoa, this must be what God is like. Now, is that what happens? So this is like a big deal, right? So this church thing really matters because what it shows. So Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote this that I saw the other day, or I heard the other day and loved it. He said this: the church is the place where Jesus Christ taking form is proclaimed, meaning who he is, and where it happens, meaning how it's lived out. And so people should see like, oh, this is what Jesus meant. Oh, this is what God is like because I've encountered those who follow Jesus. Because, man, together we are the temple. Together we represent the presence of God. Together the Spirit of God is at work in us. And it changes everything. And so you might say, well, how do you know if the Spirit of God is working? Well, the Spirit of God works. And so this is how you know. So if someone ever mentions, oh, the Spirit is moving, or someone ever mentions this is the Spirit of God, always hit pause for a second because you want to say, okay, what does that mean? Like you might have said to someone else or whatever. So the Spirit of God will always do a couple of things I think are really important. The Spirit of God always will lead us to what Jesus taught. The Spirit of God always does that. The Spirit of God will not lead you to something that Jesus did not teach, okay? So the Spirit of God will always lead us towards what Jesus taught. The Spirit of God will always glorify God. So if it doesn't glorify God, then it is not the Spirit of God. It's some other kind of spirit. If in the end, God is not glorified for who he is, then that is not the Spirit of God, okay? And I would say the third thing, I know I said two things, but it's three things. The Spirit of God will also produce fruit. Okay, so the Spirit of God will also produce fruit. Paul, the same guy, writes in Galatians 5 that the Spirit of God will produce this kind of fruit. And there's more than this, but this is like a good way to think about it, that it's love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, and self-control. Okay, so you see those things as the fruit that comes out. So if we don't see those things coming out, then it is not the Spirit of God. So that's a good way to see like, all right, is the Spirit of God actually moving? So when we see that in community together, then it's like, okay, that is the presence of God, and that is what the church should be. I wrote this down this week. I said, it is hard to be the presence of God when we are more concerned with the approval of others and our own desires. And that's where we are, and that's where we get lost. And that's where we need to be incredibly sensitive to. And here's the last point, that the church should show that it's community over individual. That it's community over individual. 1 Corinthians 12, verses 12 through 14 says this: just as a body, though one, has many parts, but all its parts form one body, so it is with Christ. For we were all baptized by what? One Spirit, so as to form one body, whether Jew or Gentile, slave or free. We are all given the one spirit to drink. Even so, the body is not made up of one part, but of what? Many. Okay, so what we begin to see here, that it's about community over individual. Individual faith is actually like a pretty modern concept that kind of ties in with Western thinking. When you read the Bible, the idea of individual faith, is it there? It is, but it's in a very small format because everything was so communal. And so even when you think communal, marriage was communal, okay? What I mean by that is any marriage that happened was for the good of the community, and any divorce that happened actually hurt the community. And so you think everything was communal. Everything you did was communal. So even when we see this, we're like, oh, a faith is supposed to represent community over the individual. So when you see people say something like this, well, I am the church. No, we are the church. We are the church. The second you start going to now you and I are a part of the church, but we are the church collectively together. When one part hurts, we all hurt. When one part celebrates, we all celebrate. The church should be, ideally, this is why we have the line diversity in thought, not division in community, which is unbelievably hard, right? It's incredibly hard. It pushes and pulls. It critiques, it does all these different things, and it's hard, and sometimes we mess it up, and sometimes I might say something I regret saying, or some things I go too far, or sometimes you might, or sometimes someone else might, right? It's kind of this push and this pull, and it's hard, it's everything, but we are the church together. That is the ideal. And that we proceed together, that we show community together, that we go about all of this together as one body, and that every part matters. Every little part matters. And so I don't know if you guys have ever broken a toe or hurt your pinky toe, right? If you break a pinky toe, you're like, how in the world does this thing hurt this much? How can I possibly walk? And if you break a pinky toe, let's say, you start walking weird. And what happens when you start walking weird? Well, all of a sudden that starts hurting maybe your ankle or the other part of your foot, but then it kind of runs up to your knee. And then that starts getting off, and all of a sudden it starts shooting up your back, and then you have back problems, right? And so all of a sudden that little pinky toe did something different, but the other, what if that toe gets healthy? Oh, then the rest can get healthy too. So every little part matters. And so you might be thinking to yourself, but I don't want to be the pinky toe. Well, maybe you are. And that's okay. It's okay to be the pinky toe. All right. And some of you might want to be, I want to be the bicep because the bicep's strong, right? I want to do that. And it's like, you might be, but we all have our specific roles, but it's all together, right? It all matters together as one body. We are the church. It's community over everything. And so in order to have solid community, you got to be involved. You got to be attached. And so I wrote a couple of things down here that I think are important. For the community to grow and to think communally, you got to have in your own life, you got to have daily habits. You've got to be growing, be a self-feeder in your faith. You've got to have, think about your sphere of influence, whether that's work, at home, or the family, as this opportunity to be a part of the church, to have your role with the bigger kind of, you got to think about it this way, man, this part of my life is one part of the whole. And we think of it that way because it affects the community so much. We've got to make community a priority. Yes, that means attending, whether it's online or in person at a watch party, whatever. Being connected to people, we've got to make that a priority. If it's not a priority, then you're not going to be committed to it. If it's not a priority, it can't be a priority if you're not committed, right? So you've got to be committed. It's got to be a priority. So that can be serving in different ways. That can be being a part of discipleship, being in a community group. Community group signups are happening right now and are starting really soon. To be connected to people, right? That's what we're supposed to do. Even when you think, for parents, if you're a parent, why would your child inherently choose to think church is important or faith is important when you might constantly have them missing it? Or you might choose to travel every weekend. You might choose to do all these different things and take them away from church all the time. And then they start making decisions down the road. And you're like, why don't they see how important your faith is? And it's like, well, because you raised them to think football was, or baseball was, or basketball was, or soccer was, or dance was, or art was, or singing was, or whatever, you name it, right? Or vacationing was, or whatever. Are any of those things bad? No, they can all be good, but they need to be in the proper context. And so even if you're single and you're like, I don't have kids, I'm getting off on this one. Are you doing the right habits now and committed to the right things now, so that if you do meet a person, like that, you have the right behavioral patterns there to be committed to the right things together. I thought about this too. We're committing our time, our talents, and our resources to all of this. The average salary in Richmond is a little over 50 grand. And so I lessened it a little bit and did 45 grand. And this is just math, you guys. If 45 grand was the average salary in our community, which we probably easily have, and every person gave 5%, we as a church would have to figure out how to give away roughly $2.7 million more a year. So you see how important community becomes over just simply the individual. And so some of you guys are like, man, I'm way above 5%. That's awesome. And you keep growing in that. That's awesome. Some of you might be at 1% and you're like, I'm just trying to figure out and take steps. That's great. Keep doing that. Some of you guys have not started that process that you should take a step and be committed to it. Because here's the reality. In community, we build resilience. In community, we begin to show the hope of the future, the hope of the world, and we start being in the presence of God, and we start showing people a picture of the kingdom of heaven. And I'm going to end with this. Jesus builds his church. Jesus builds his church. We represent who Jesus is. We represent the presence of God. And as we do that in committed community together, what ends up happening in the church is that it begins to speak life, not death, reveal hope, not negativity or pessimism. We are humble, not prideful. And then what ends up happening is that injustice and evil and immorality will tremble in fear. Not because I said that, because that's what Jesus says will happen. Let's pray. So God, this morning, some of us are in an awesome spot with you, and they're just shaking their heads yes, or they're saying amen, or they're just saying, yeah, this is what we do. Some folks are realizing maybe their hearts have become hardened. Some are trying to figure out, man, is this something I want to actually do? And maybe even this is a day where you choose, I want to really genuinely confess Jesus as Lord and see that life transformation and be a part of this hope, be a part of this future, be a part of something that has so much purpose and so much meaning, in the one thing that actually can speak life and hope into the darkness that we see all around us. So God, in the areas that we're lost, I pray that we will see how we got there and that we were lost in the first place. In the areas that we need to be rerouted, God, I pray that we will be open to what that means and be willing to say, I'm not going to fight this anymore. God, I'm going to trust the direction that you have for me. And through that, we will see a fullness of life. Through that, we will see what we were specifically designed for. Through that, God, a light will shine out of us that isn't otherwise possible. So God, we just love you and thank you for the plans and the purpose you have for us. In your name we pray. Amen. All right, guys, so we've got the worship night happening tonight, which I'm super excited about to celebrate. But also, again, just want to always continue to say thank you for your generosity. I know I mentioned it in the sermon, and I had a little challenge there too. But, Matt, who's on staff here, was just sharing this past week how we just had the opportunity to help someone, a specific individual who was homeless, literally living on the street, and also had to go through some counseling, some different things. And he was sharing how, and I thought this was pretty powerful. He was sharing how this caseworker came and just said, hey, you're the first church that I've ever worked with. I don't ever see churches getting involved. He goes, I personally, and it might happen with other people, but he's like, I don't ever see people and churches actually getting involved like this. And I really wish more people would do things like this. And so that's a really cool thing to just hear something like that and to be connected with that. And now we're having these opportunities to do more things to help people like that. And because of your generosity, we're able to do that. So thank you so much for the change that's happening. Be a part of just an awesome influence here in Richmond. You guys, thank you. Love you so much. Have a great rest of your week. And hopefully, if you're here in Richmond, we will see you tonight at the worship night. Love you all.
Thanks so much for being a part of this morning. If you're out there and have questions, prayer needs, or want to talk to someone about next steps in your faith, then there are a couple ways to follow up. You can click on the chat button and connect with one of our guest services hosts, or click on the link and simply fill out a connection card. We'll see you next week.